The lecture you are about to see is part of our annual Alan Edwards Psychology Lecture Series. Professor Edwards was affiliated with the Department of Psychology for half a century until his death in 1994. He was an outstanding teacher, researcher, and writer who introduced new statistical techniques that are credited with changing the way modern psychological research is conducted. Alan also permanently enhanced the intellectual climate at UW Psychology by endowing the Alan Edwards Lectureship, which since 1999 has brought in an impressive list of renowned psychologists to the UW campus to interact with faculty and students. The lecture you're about to watch is one of a pair given back-to-back that matched a UW psychology professor with a visiting researcher to talk about a topic of great public and scientific interest.
I would like to introduce Dr. Rebecca Saxe, who's visiting us from MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She received her BA degree in psychology and philosophy from Oxford University in 2000. She received a Ph.D. in cognitive science from MIT. And then she was a junior fellow at Harvard University from 2003 to 2006. She's presently an assistant professor at MIT in the Brain and Cognitive Sciences group. Now, although she's relatively early in her professional career, Professor Saxe has emerged as a leading figure in her research field. She's received a number of prestigious awards from some of the most well-known professional organizations in psychology, including the American Psychological Association, the National Academy of Sciences, and the Cognitive Neuroscience Society. Also, Dr. Saxe is an associate editor for the journals Social Neuroscience and also Social, Cognitive, and Affective Neuroscience. In terms of her own research, Dr. Saxe is principal investigator on several research grants from the Office of Naval Research and also foundations such as the Simons Foundation, the Ellison Foundation, John Merck's Scholars Program, and the Alliance of Civilizations Media Fund. Dr. Saxe has co-edited a book on theory of mind as well, and she is author, of course, of a large number of excellent review, opinion, and experimental papers and book chapters. Finally, Dr. Saxe has been invited to give, of course, many talks around the world and also to hold workshops. So we are very privileged to have her here tonight. Welcome.
Thanks so much. I'm very excited to be here. So I'm going to talk about a problem that's familiar to all of us as human beings, as teachers, as spouses, as scientists. And that is, I think, often posed best by novelists. So I'm going to start with an example from a novelist, Philip Roth, who wrote, "And yet, what are we to do about this terribly significant business of other people? So ill-equipped are we all to envision one another's interior workings and invisible aims." And so that's the puzzle that today's talk focuses on, is how do we envision one another's invisible aims? And following on from the talk that we heard earlier from Jessica, I'm going to start with an intuition which I think is, first of all, very intuitive, and secondly, beautifully supported in Jessica's work, which is that when we want to understand other people's minds, we start with our own minds. So what we start with is our own similar experiences. And like the babies in Jessica's studies, we're best at understanding other people when they're having experiences that are almost exactly like experiences we've had. So I can understand a reach and grasp movement if I've done a reach and grasp movement. I can understand pulling a cloth to get a toy only when I can pull a cloth to get a toy. So the lesson from Jessica's work is that really early on in life, when infants are unimaginably small and incompetent, they already have an insight into other people's minds, but that insight is very limited. It's limited to the ways that other people are just like them. So that's beautiful and amazing, but suggests a puzzle, which is that as adults, and maybe even as children, we seem to go beyond the ways that other people are similar to us. So how do we understand other people's experiences, interior workings, and invisible aims, when those experiences are not similar to the things we've done ourselves? So for example, never having had a child, how can I begin to imagine the experience of a mother looking at her child? It seems like we can do that. Or if you've never jumped off a cliff, how do you imagine or understand what that man is feeling? These are both researchers in my lab on their off days. So how can we get beyond the details of our own experience to understand other minds when they are most different from our own? So in today's talk, I'm going to talk about predominantly how we understand other people's minds when they're different from ours. And I'm going to start with the simple cases that are more related to the topics that Jessica talked about, namely the ways that our minds may be different just in the moment. Our current desires, thoughts, and beliefs, mine may be different from yours. So whereas you may be desiring a drink of alcohol and I'm mostly looking for a cup of coffee, the temporary, moment-to-moment differences between what I think or desire and what you do, that's one kind of problem. Perhaps a deeper problem is how we understand other people's experiences when they're fundamentally different from our own, when they're having an experience that not only we're not having right now, but the likes of which we have never had. So for example, somebody who's never been a parent, trying to understand the mental experience of a parent. So I'll come back to that deeper challenge. But over the course of this talk, I'm going to make 3 arguments. The first is that in general, our ability to get beyond our own experience, to understand others when they differ from ourselves, depends on a special brain system, a dedicated brain system in the human brain that has this as its predominant function. Secondly, that unlike the capacities Jessica talked about, which emerge in the very first year, early on in infancy, that these capacities develop very slowly over the whole course of childhood. And then finally, these capacities let us bridge very deep differences between our own mental experiences and those of others. So to start with the simple problem, how we understand that other people's temporary desires and beliefs can be different from ours, Jessica introduced the simplest case, which is just a momentary desire. I want an apple and you want an orange. And as she described, the earliest evidence that infants can understand these differences between minds shows up sometime in the first year of life. Infants already have an inkling that whereas I want an apple, they may want an orange. So that's the simplest version, but there's a harder version of this problem, where it's not just a momentary preference, but actually a belief about the state of the world that may differ between you and me. And this slightly harder problem is called the false belief task. It's now been run in thousands of children all over the world. And I'm going to show you an example of it here. What I'm going to show you first is a 5-year-old who's all over this task. And then I'll show you a 3-year-old who's still struggling with understanding how other people could have different beliefs than his own. So we'll start with the 5-year-old. This is the first pirate. His name is Ivan. And you know what pirates really like?
What?
Pirates really like cheese sandwiches.
Cheese. I love cheese.
Yeah. So Ivan has his cheese sandwich and he says, yum, 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 yum. I really love cheese sandwiches. And Ivan puts his sandwich over here on top of the pirate chest. And Ivan says, you know what? I need a drink with my lunch. And so Ivan goes to get a drink. And while Ivan is away, the wind comes. And it blows the sandwich down onto the grass. And now, here comes the other pirate. This pirate is called Joshua. See? And Joshua also really loves cheese sandwich. So Joshua has a cheese sandwich. And he says, yum, 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 yum. I love cheese sandwiches. And he puts his cheese sandwich over here on top of the pirate chest.
So that one is his.
That one's Joshua's. That's right.
And then his went on the ground.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Now.
So he won't know which one is his.
Oh, so now Joshua goes off to get a drink. Ivan comes back and he says, I want my cheese sandwich. So which one do you think Ivan's going to take?
I think he was going to take that one.
Yeah, you think he's going to take that one? All right, let's see.
I told you.
Oh, yeah, you were right. He took that one. I told you, he says. Okay, so that kid understood that although Ivan's sandwich is the one on the ground, Ivan thinks his sandwich is the one on top of the chest. And so Ivan's going to take that one, the one that he thinks is his. And as you saw, the 5-year-old anticipated that that problem was going to arise. He saw it coming. Now, here's a 3-year-old who heard the same story and paid equally rapt attention all the way through. I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but he was rapt. And now we get to the end where I ask him to make a similar prediction. And Ivan says, I want my cheese sandwich. Which sandwich is he going to take? Do you think he's going to take that one? Let's see what happens. Let's see what he does. Here comes Ivan, and he says, I want my cheese sandwich. And he takes this one. Uh-oh. Why'd he take that one?
His was on the raft.
Uh-huh. So the 3-year-old does two things differently. First of all, when I said Ivan wants his cheese sandwich, which one is he going to take? He said, I know, his cheese sandwich. If he wants his cheese sandwich, he's going to take his cheese sandwich. And then when that prediction turned out to be wrong, when Ivan took the other cheese sandwich, the 3-year-old didn't do what you or I or the 5-year-old would do, is say, well, he must think that one's his. Instead, he came up with a new explanation. Well, his had fallen on the ground, so he's taking the other one because he doesn't want his anymore for some reason. Okay, so that's the false belief task, this ability to predict and explain actions that somebody else will do based on a critical belief that they hold that happens to be false, namely Ivan's belief that the sandwich on the chest is his cheese sandwich. And as I said, this task has been run on thousands of children all over the world, and there's sort of a basic pattern that has been found over and over again. First of all, by 5 years old, children pass this task. They have no problem, as you saw. But at 3 years old, like the kids that I showed you, it's not just that they're confused. They don't look at that task and say, I have no idea what Ivan's going to do. They have a very strong prediction, as you probably saw with this 3-year-old. He knew what Ivan was going to do. Ivan was going to take his cheese sandwich, and he couldn't wait to show me that Ivan was going to take his cheese sandwich. So it's not confusion, it's some other theory of what Ivan's going to do. And you see that at 3 years. This transition in performance on this task has been observed all over the world. So not only in industrialized countries like Canada, the US, and England, where it was first tested, and Germany, but also now in hunter-gatherer tribes in Africa. The same transition occurs at the same ages. And the main population in which there is an exception, where the transition doesn't happen between 3 and 5, is children with autistic spectrum disorders. And so this seems like, in some sense, the exception that proves the rule. There's something that makes typical human development proceed so that by 5, kids are getting this kind of task, and that's missing specifically in autism. So this pattern of data, which has been known for 20 years, initially suggested that maybe there's something special about our ability to understand what's going on in the false belief task and make correct action predictions. And whatever it is that's letting us do that can be selectively targeted by a disease like autism. And if that's right, then scientists hypothesized, well, maybe it's because there's a special brain system in the human brain that supports typical development and that can be selectively damaged somehow by the developmental processes of autism. Now, when that hypothesis was first articulated in the 80s, there was no easy way to test that idea, that there was a special brain system. But since then, many new tools have become available that let cognitive scientists look at the healthy human brain while it's functioning and ask about what brain systems support these very high-level kinds of cognitive functions. Those tools include ways of measuring the electrical activity inside the brain, like EEG and MEG that I won't talk about today. Ways of measuring blood flow or metabolism inside the brain, like PET scans or MRI scans that you might have heard of, which will be the bulk of what I talk about today. And ways of measuring brain function by temporarily disrupting it via transcranial magnetic stimulation, and I'll talk about that as well. So to start with functional MRI, which is the main tool that we use in our lab, if you were a participant in one of our studies, we would invite you into the experiment, make sure you had no metal on your clothes or in your body, and introduce you to this enormous magnet. And we would get you lying on your back on that tray and slide you inside the magnet so that you'd be inside the donut of this magnet down to your knees. This is not a particularly natural context for social interaction, but we can get around that by having you, while you're inside the scanner, watch movies or read stories where we can control what's going on in the movie or what's going on in the story, so we can sort of control what you're thinking about at any given moment. This is a picture of me about to go into the scanner, looking unusually pleased. And this is a picture of my brain that we took. So this is an anatomical scan that just shows you a picture of my brain. Fortunately, it's all there. and just its anatomy. What are its parts? But what we want to know is not just the anatomy, where is the brain, where are the folds, where are the bits and pieces, but which bits of the brain are active while you're doing different kinds of tasks. And so the way we do that is, in addition to measuring anatomy, we measure over time while you're reading stories or watching movies, changes in oxygen flow to your brain. And just like a muscle that when you use it uses up oxygen, when you use a bit of your brain, it uses up the local supply of oxygen. And so we can see changes in the local supply of oxygen to different bits of your brain over time and ask, where in your brain is the oxygen change related to what we're asking you to do in our task? And when we do that, we look for differences. So where is the oxygen flow higher while you're reading, for example, one kind of story compared to another kind of story? And then we translate those statistics, the difference in oxygen flow, into a color scheme because it looks pretty. And we show you things that look like brains on fire. But the color there, it's not that the brain really lights up. There's no lights in there. It's just the color is telling you something about the significance of the difference between the blood flow in the two conditions. So these are fake data, but I'll show you only real data from now on. OK, so we put people inside our big magnet, and we ask them to do a false belief task. For adults, it's not pirates and cheese sandwiches. But it's the same kind of problem. We ask them to read short stories that have very similar structures. So for example, we might ask them to read a story like this. John told Emily he had a Porsche. Actually, his car is a Ford. Emily doesn't know anything about cars, so she believed John. And then we can ask either, what kind of car does John have? Or what kind of car does Emily think John has? So sometimes they're reading stories like that. Sometimes they're reading stories we call photograph stories that describe the formation of a photograph. So for example, a photograph was taken of an apple hanging on a tree branch. The film took half an hour to develop. This must be the old days. In the meantime, a strong wind blew the apple to the ground. And now again, we can ask, where's the apple? Or we can ask, in the photograph, where's the apple? And of course, in order to do any of these tasks, many, many, many brain regions are involved. You need to read the stories. You need to consider them. You need to make a button press answer to answer the question we're asking you. But what we want to know is, where does the blood oxygen change when you're reading the stories about beliefs and not when you're reading the stories about photographs? So if we ask that, then we can look in the brain. This is in the brains of a population we call typical human adults. They're MIT undergraduates. And we can see where in their brains is there more blood flow when they're reading the stories about beliefs than when they're reading the stories about photographs. So as you see, there's a number of brain regions where that's true. In today's talk, partly for simplicity and partly because this is where the data come out the most beautifully, I'm going to focus on one brain region called the right temporoparietal junction. It's above and behind your right ear at the junction between the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe. And don't worry if you can't remember the acronym. OK, so the first hypothesis that I suggested to you is that this brain region constitutes a specialized brain region specifically for thinking about other people's thoughts when they differ from our own, and not for doing all the various other impressive things we do with our brains. But I don't have time to show you all the evidence we have for that hypothesis, but I'll show you just one little bit of evidence. So I've shown you two kinds of stories, stories about beliefs and stories about photographs. But in our experiments, we've had people read all kinds of stories. And I'm just going to show you three other examples. So we could have people read about thoughts which are not false, just thoughts. So for example, Nicky knew his sister's flight from San Francisco was delayed 10 hours. Only one flight was delayed so much that night. And so when he got to the airport, he knew that flight was hers. So this should, again, require the ability to think about somebody else's thoughts. In a second condition, we ask people to read stories about physical sensations that aren't thoughts, that can't be false or different, don't represent the world, that are just internal sensations. For example, Sheila skipped breakfast because she was late for the train. By the time she got off the train, she was starving. Her stomach was rumbling, and she could smell food everywhere. And then in a third kind of story, we described people's physical appearance, what they look like from the outside. So for example, Andrew had just had a growth spurt, so he was gangly and rather awkward. Like most teenagers, he had bad skin and bad taste in clothes. He wore mostly baggy jeans and flannel shirts. So now we can ask, OK, in this brain region, how does blood flow change while people are reading these 3 new kinds of stories? The first question is, do we again show the finding I showed you before, which is this brain region shows more blood flow when you're reading, or shows a lot of blood flow when you're reading stories about somebody's thoughts? Unfortunately, the answer is yes, so that's change over time in the blood oxygen in this brain region, and you can see it going up as they're reading the stories about thoughts. By contrast, if they're reading stories about physical appearance of somebody, it doesn't go up at all. It stays right around 0. So just reading about somebody's physical appearance, even though it's a fact about a person, doesn't activate this brain region. And actually, even reading stories about internal sensations that aren't thoughts doesn't get this brain region going. So you need to be reading about somebody else's mental experience, not their internal sensations or physical appearance, to get this brain region going. So this brain region, the right TPJ, I've been friends with it for a decade now. And the hypothesis that I'm going to talk about for this talk is that this is the brain region that lets us understand other people's thoughts and beliefs, in particular when they are different from our own. And so I'm going to continue to show you more and more evidence for that as the talk goes along. And the first thing that I want to do is go beyond the original false belief task, because although that's a very hard problem for a 3-year-old, it's trivially easy for the adults that we have in the scanner. And so we want to push the adults a little bit harder, give them a harder challenge, and then see if we can see this brain region working to help them solve that challenge. So the harder challenge that we provide to our adults is that of forgiving somebody for an accident. So it's one thing to predict what they're going to do based on a false belief, and quite another thing when they accidentally spoil your favorite shirt to be totally forgiving because they didn't mean to. Right? This is the example that we were hearing about earlier about legal decisions that ride on thinking about intent have this form. And just to give you a sense that it's harder, I'm going to show you the simplest possible version of forgiving an accident, and I'm going to show it to you in the example of the children I showed you before. So remember, Ivan came back, and he takes Joshua's sandwich, the sandwich on the chest. And now I'm going to ask each kid for a moral judgment of Ivan's action. So this is the 3-year-old. Now the 3-year-old thinks Ivan took Joshua's sandwich just because his own sandwich was dirty, for no particularly good reason. And critically, just before I ask this question, I say, Joshua comes back, he sees Ivan eating his sandwich, and he starts to cry. Okay, so there's a harm has been caused. And now I'm going to ask the 3-year-old to make a moral judgment. Now, is Ivan being mean and naughty for taking Joshua's sandwich?
Yeah.
Yeah. Should Ivan get in trouble for taking Joshua's sandwich? Yeah. Yes. Which is fair. If you took somebody else's sandwich just because you didn't want yours, like that would be mean and naughty, especially since Joshua's crying. Okay, now here's the 5-year-old. The 5-year-old knows exactly why Ivan took Joshua's sandwich. Remember, he anticipated me. I didn't even have to ask him the question. He knew there was a problem, that Ivan was confused about which sandwich was his. And now again, I'm going to ask for a moral judgment. Was Ivan being mean and naughty for taking Joshua's sandwich?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not until 2 years later, this is now a 7-year-old, the kids see a way out of the problem. Should Ivan get in trouble for taking Joshua's sandwich?
No, because the wind should get in trouble.
Oh. He says the wind should get in trouble for creating the problem in the first place. All right. So a lawyer in the making. Okay, so that's the kids' version. In the scanner, we ask adults to do a very similar task, but in a slightly more adult version. So we have them reading a story, for example, a story about Grace and her friend who are taking a tour of a chemical plant, and they stop to get a cup of coffee. Grace is making the coffee for both of them, and her friend asks for sugar in her coffee. Next to the coffee is a container of white powder. This container is actually toxic poison left behind by some of the scientists, but it's labeled sugar, and so Grace thinks the powder is sugar. She puts the powder in the coffee, and her friend drinks it and dies. And then we ask, in the scanner, we ask the typical human adults, how much should Grace be blamed for putting the powder in the coffee? And how many people here in the room think Grace should be blamed for putting the powder in the coffee? Anybody? Nobody at all. Wow. At least a few people, okay. So in our experiments, we find that people actually disagree. Some people say, she thought it was sugar. It's white powder. It's next to the coffee. It's labeled sugar. She really should not be blamed for putting it in the coffee. And some people say, well, look, she killed her friend. And she was in a chemical plant, right? Like maybe she shouldn't have put white powder in the coffee in a chemical plant. And so we can start with, we can say, okay, well, there's a difference in people's moral judgments that seem to reflect how much importance you give to her mental state. Did she have reason to believe it was sugar? Versus how much importance you give to the other factors, like how much harm did she cause? She killed her friend. And so we can look across many scenarios at people's judgments, and we find that people differ in which moral judgments they make of these accidents. So what I'm going to show you on this graph is different people's moral judgments. What I'm showing you for top to bottom is for each person, on average, how much blame did they assign for the accidents. So remember, if they assign more blame, that means they're paying less attention to the innocent beliefs. If they assign less blame, that's because they're saying, well, she really didn't know she was going to cause harm, and so she doesn't deserve to be blamed. And then on the x-axis, I'm showing you how much activity there was in this brain region in each person. And what you can see is that people with more activity in this brain region pay more attention to the belief and give less blame, whereas people with less activity in this brain region pay less attention to the belief and assign more blame. So all of this fits with this idea that this activity in this brain region is what's letting us pay attention to and use information about other people's mental states even when they differ from our own. But it's not the strongest possible evidence. The strongest possible evidence would be if I could somehow directly change activity in this brain region, and by doing that, change people's moral judgments in these kinds of contexts. And we can do that. So the way we do that is with a technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation. What this is a way of passing a magnetic pulse through the skull into a targeted brain region inside a participant's brain, which temporarily disorganizes the neural activity in that brain region. And to give you a sense of what this is like, I'm going to show you a video of me being TMS'd. So what I'm going to show you first is this is a magnetic pulse. It's not physical force. I'm not being hit. It's a magnetic pulse going through my skull into my brain. And to show you it's magnetic, the first thing I'm going to do is put a quarter on the machine. So you'll see me with the coil that delivers the pulse. I'm going to put a quarter on it, and you'll hear click, click, click. That's the machine going off, and you'll see what happens to the quarter. Then we'll put it on my brain. Okay, and we're aiming this at my motor cortex, where my motor cortex controls my hand.
Ready, Rebecca?
Yep.
Ready?
Yep. I couldn't get it. It's just a little twitch, as you saw. So as you can see, what this does is it creates a little burst of firing in the part of my brain that controls my hand. That makes a little twitch in my hand. Right? Not a huge effect, but nevertheless a real one. Okay, so now we can go back to our original task, and instead of putting the TMS over motor cortex, we can put it either in a control brain region, so a little bit behind the right TPJ that I've been talking about, or directly on the right TPJ. We aim it by figuring out where each individual's right TPJ is, and then aiming the coil either exactly at that region or just a little bit behind it. Of course, individual participants don't know where their RTPJ is, so they don't know which condition they're in at any given moment. And we can go back to the moral judgment task and ask, either after you've had TMS to a different brain region or after you've had TMS to this key RTPJ brain region, how much do you say Grace should be blamed? And what we find is that although they say she should be blamed somewhat after having TMS to the control brain region, they say she should be blamed more if they've just had TMS to the right TPJ. So that is paying less attention to her innocent beliefs, more attention to the outcome, resulting in more blame. Okay, so that's a set of experiments that say this is a brain region whose activity is correlated with and whose function is necessary for our ability to think about other people's mental states when they're different from our own, to predict their actions, to explain their actions, and to make moral judgments. And now I'm going to show you a little bit of evidence for the other two things I told you about this brain region. So the first is that this function develops slowly over childhood. So unlike the simple understanding of goal-directed actions that 6-month-old infants can do on the basis of their own actions, this capacity to think about other people's mental states, their beliefs, and their intents in moral contexts, shows slow development all the way through childhood. You already know that in part because of what I showed you in the videos, because we see different stages from 3 to 5 to 7. But another question is, well, do we see a similarly extended time course of development of function in the brain? So recently, my lab has started scanning kids. Until then, we always scanned our typical human adults. Scanning kids has a whole bunch of new surprises, challenges, and rewards. So we ask the children who participate in our experiments what they think about it afterwards. This is one kid's summary of what he discovered. In general, the kids love looking at the pictures of their brain. They bring them to show and tell afterwards. One they particularly like is an image we give them of what their head looks like just behind the front of their head, where you see a little bit of brain and ginormous eyeballs, and they look like an alien. It's very popular. Another child, just this week actually, a 6-year-old who came in from the scan, spent an hour with us inside the fMRI room, which I showed you the picture of it earlier, and left the room and completely unprompted built us a perfect Lego model of what this scanner looks like. It was amazing. Unexpected rewards. So having gone through all this, showing you first the child task and then the adult task, now I've shown you what we do with adults inside the scanner. So I'm going to show you the child version. We can't have children read stories. Some of the 6-year-olds don't read particularly well. And also, the stories that we had written for adults don't really work for kids. And so we constructed a whole new set of stimuli of stories that they now hear in the scanner. So while they're lying inside the scanner, they're now hearing over earphones somebody reading them a story. And they hear stories in 3 different conditions. So here, I'm going to play you examples of what the children would hear.
When Li Chi turned 10, she discovered why her friends were disappearing. They were being taken to Garberville by a lonely and selfish fairy. Li Chi felt very mad and sad when she thought about her friends so far away from their families. She wanted to do something to help.
Okay, so lots of information about mental states, thoughts, emotions, and desires. A second condition, they hear about people, but not mental state information.
The new girl in the class was dressed in the same clothes as everyone else, but she still looked different. Her eyes weren't blue or green or brown. They were yellow, and her hair wasn't blonde or brown or black. It was green. Even her skin had a strange pale glow, like the moon.
Okay, and in the last condition, we just described the physical world.
In the tiny town of Chew and Swallow, it rained or snowed 3 times each day, once during breakfast, once during lunch, and once during dinner. But it never rained rain, and it never snowed snow. It rained things like soup and juice, and snowed things like mashed potatoes.
Okay, so kids are hearing these stories in the scanner, and actually they don't mind this at all. They don't mind sitting there and listening to us read them these stories. And that gives us a chance to look in their brain and see what brain regions, again, are disproportionately showing oxygen or blood flow while they're listening to stories about mental states compared to when they're listening to stories about the physical world. So for reference, this is, again, activity in adults while they're doing the belief task versus the photo task that I showed to you before. And again, you can see the standard pattern of activity. I have the red arrow marking the right TPJ, this brain region I've been talking about all along. If we now look in a group of 18 children aged 6 to 12 years, we see exactly the same brain region. So all the same brain regions are recruited in these children aged 6 to 12 years while they're listening to the stories about mental states compared to the physical stories. So initially this seems like not very good evidence for development because the 6 to 12-year-olds look just like the adults. But if we look in a more detailed way, what we find is actually something quite different. So again, when I showed you this the original evidence I had about this brain region, I said it was specialized. And what I meant by that was that if you look at activity to mental information, you get this high response, high change in blood flow, but basically no response to anything else, nothing to social information, other stuff about people, and nothing to physical facts about the world. And again, this is now adults listening to the same stories as the children, and we show that same result. No response to either the physical or the social information. But if we look at slightly younger children, kids between 8 and 12 years, it looks like maybe there's this separation, like maybe there's sort of an intermediate response to the social information. And if we look even younger at kids who are 5 to 8, that's even more obvious, that this brain region seems to respond to any social information in the youngest children. And it's getting progressively specialized over development. So you start with a brain region playing a function in thinking about people in general. And slowly over the course of childhood, this brain region is getting more and more specialized, so that by the time you're an adult, it just does just this one thing, namely let you think about their thoughts. So that's the evidence, or some of the evidence we have, that just like the behavior that I showed you in the videos, the brain mechanism for letting us think about other people's thoughts is showing slow developmental changes even after age 5 years, between 5 years and adulthood. But all the way through this whole talk, I focused on what is the easy problem for people, for us, which is thinking about other people's thoughts or desires that are different from our own in the moment. They're currently having a different thought from the thought that we're having. But all of these are thoughts we could have. So even though at the moment you may want an apple and I may want an orange, or you may think it's your sandwich and I think it's my sandwich, each of those are easily interchangeable. I could want an apple. I might have thought that that was your sandwich. So it's perfectly easy to imagine myself in your shoes. So how does this brain region help us get beyond those limitations to understand other people's experiences that are different from our own in a more fundamental way, because they're having lifelong experiences for which we have no analogy? Now, it might seem hard to figure out how to test this, and it puzzled me for a while. But the case example because you have to think of, well, what's an example of a group of people where you can be sure that there's a set of mental experiences that they know about but have never had? And the example that we've started working on is blind people thinking about sight. So blind people certainly have, these are people blind from birth, so they have no personal experience of what it's like to see. And at first you might think that would mean they know nothing about what it's like to see. And that's certainly not true. They live in a world of sighted people who talk about seeing all the time. And as you heard in the talk earlier, the way people talk about their mental lives is a huge source of evidence for us in figuring out what their mental life is like. And so if you ask blind people about seeing, it turns out that they know an awful lot. So for example, this is one example of a blind woman, blind from birth, who was asked to define a bunch of mental state verbs, verbs of seeing. And this definition that she provided of the verb to notice gives me the shivers. She said, to notice is to see something that comes into your view, but not only to see it, but to perceive it and understand it. You could sit on this rocking chair and not notice the color of it at all. Of course, she's never seen color. So her understanding of what notice is, what see is, what it is for something to be in your view, and what role color plays in that perception is incredibly deep for somebody who's never had any experience like that. And perhaps even more mind-blowing is the artist Ashraf Amirjan, again, blind from birth, who has spent his life asking people to tell him about what visual perception is like, and translates this knowledge into paintings. So these are paintings by a congenitally blind artist, showing not just color, but perspective and depth relationships. So it seems like you can learn an awful lot about what sight is like without experiencing sight. Or at least you can look like you've learned a lot. You can paint like it, you can talk like it. But a concern might be that what's going on is blind people are just talking the talk. They've learned the surface form of how to behave like you understand verbs of seeing, or how to paint like you know what it would be like to see. But they don't really understand other people's experience of sight. And what brain imaging gives us a chance to do is to say, well, here's one definition of what it would be for them to really understand it. It would be for them to think about sight using the very same brain mechanisms that we sighted people use when we think about sight. And that would be going beyond talking the talk to really having the same mental representations that we have. So we tested this. First, we had to make sure that we could find the same brain regions in the blind that we can find in the sighted. So again, this is a group of sighted adults. This is now the first data I'm showing you from normal adults, not just MIT undergrads. So these are age and education matched to the congenitally blind adults. And again, we find the same pattern of activation. The red arrow marks the RTPJ. And if we look in a group of adults born blind, we see, again, the same pattern of activation, including the RTPJ. So now we can say, OK, when you're thinking in general about beliefs, it doesn't matter if you're blind or not, you use the same brain regions. Now, what about if we target the question to thinking about seeing versus thinking about other kinds of mental experiences that you have had if you're blind? So we did this by having them listen to stories now about we first found this brain region, then they listened to 4 different kinds of stories. One we call belief seeing. In these stories, somebody gets information by seeing something. So Eric is going to meet his future in-laws. When he gets to the restaurant, he sees his fiancée, and her face looks happy. So that should be something that a blind person has never personally experienced. And we compare that to a case of something for which they do have a close analogy. So for example, when he gets to the restaurant, he hears her talking to her parents, and she is laughing happily. So now an auditory experience. And then we have 2 other control conditions to get a better sense of the full pattern. A physical feeling case. So when he gets to the restaurant, something smells delicious. He feels hungry and ready for dinner. Remember, from the previous evidence, we think this should not get much of a response in this brain region. And a control physical case where there's no people at all. It's an opening day for a new bridge over the river. Once the bridge is open, it will be architecturally unique in the world. It's elegant and functional. Okay. So now, again, in both the sighted and the blind, we can ask, how does this brain region respond? What's the pattern of response across these 4 conditions? So unsurprisingly, given everything else that I've shown you, in the sighted, there's a very high response, lots of oxygen flow, when people are hearing stories about seeing and when they're hearing stories about hearing, and more in both of those conditions than either of the other 2, hearing stories about physical feelings or hearing stories about the control condition. Now, if first-person personal experience is the basis on which we understand other people's mental states, what we should see is that for the blind, hearing about seeing is somehow totally different. Hearing about hearing should be the same, but hearing about seeing is somehow something completely apart. And that's not what we find. The blind look just like the sighted. So they use the same brain region to think about somebody else hearing something, and somebody else, a sighted person, seeing something. So to go back to the original point of this talk, what I told you is that other minds differ from our own both in current temporary beliefs and desires, but also in deeper, more lifelong aspects of our experience. And that we can go beyond our first-person experience to understand others in these respects, partly because we're endowed with a special brain system, including this brain region, the right TPJ, that specifically lets us think about other people's thoughts and desires in this way. That this system, unlike the early emerging infant understanding of goal-directed action, emerges slowly all the way through the course of childhood. And that it allows us to bridge not only local temporary differences in our mental experiences, but also these deep differences in lifelong aspects of experience. And so to go back to the original challenge that Philip Roth gave us, I want to sort of end by reflecting that although the example of the blind is an extreme case, where we ask blind people to think about sight, in some sense, all of us are blind, right? The insides of other people are always invisible. And so it's not that the blind are particularly unusual. Actually, what I think our data show is that the blind are just like the rest of us, and we are just like them. We get into other people's heads not just by having had exactly similar experiences, but by being able to make these inferential leaps, causal hypotheses and theories of other people's minds that we develop through all kinds of evidence from language and from all the rest of our experience. And so that means, in fact, that Philip Roth is wrong. We're not at all ill-equipped. In fact, we are amazingly well-equipped to understand one another's interior workings and invisible aims. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was amazing. I'm sure there's lots of questions. This would be a good time for, if any of you have questions, if you want to move to the microphones on either side of the auditorium, that would be great. In the meantime, I might ask you a quick question. So we talked about the development of the activation of the brain structure as well as the understanding. And you went up to age 12. And noticeably absent to me, maybe because I have teenage children, is what happens, what's the developmental pattern during the teenage years? Because then you had adults at the other end.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it's very interesting. We initially studied 6 to 12-year-olds because developmental psychologists, of whom I am one, have a habit of always wanting to know what's the youngest that something happens, what's the earliest evidence, what's the first stage. And so the current debate about how this ability to think about other people's thoughts develops, the current debate in the literature is a lot about when's the first stage? Is the first stage at 4? Is it at 3? Is it at 2? Is it at 1? And when I said we wanted to study kids over 5, everybody said, well, surely by 5 it's done. For all intents and purposes, they said, 5-year-olds are adults. From the 5-year-olds I personally have met, I think that, there's 1 or 2 things they're still missing. But so we thought 5-year-olds we'll just make sure that 5-year-olds look just like adults, and then we'll go on to the very hard problem of trying to convince a 3-year-old to lie still for 45 minutes. And so it was sort of to our surprise that there was developmental change in that early childhood range. Now, actually, there's very interesting work about social development in adolescence, because one hypothesis is that it's not linear. It's not just you get better and better and better, but that something different and critical happens around adolescence when all of a sudden what other people think becomes of utmost importance in a way that isn't continuous between the 5-year-olds and the adults. It's a very interesting hypothesis.
Okay, let's take one question here, and then we'll just kind of go back and forth.
First of all, that was really fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This area of the brain seems to me to be related to what I would call empathy. And that being so, I'm wondering if sociopaths have ever been tested, and to see if that area of the brain either wasn't there or didn't function in sociopaths.
Yeah, actually, I'm currently, what I'm not doing this evening, to my postdoc's distress, is working on a paper about the relationship between this brain region and empathy. So we are testing that hypothesis. I think you're right. I think empathy has to do with this. And actually, so there's very interesting research on psychopaths, which is a little bit different from sociopaths. Psychopaths, as it turns out, actually are very good at figuring out what other people are thinking. What's different is they don't care. So being able to be manipulative actually depends on being very good at figuring out what somebody else is thinking, what makes them tick. And so there's a proposal that you can think of 2 different kinds of failure or of deficit. One in autism, which makes it hard to figure out what other people are thinking, and one in psychopathy, where you know what they're thinking, but it doesn't have consequences. You don't care.
Okay, why don't we go across the room over there?
So I have a really kind of a 2-part question. Going along this adolescent line, a lot of us here are getting into different types of work around mindfulness, and I know a colleague of mine had done some work, now I can't remember his friend's name, but Brian Knutson does some fMRI work, and he was telling me that looking at issues of mindfulness and in attention in a developmental sense in later childhood and to young adulthood, that there was a big gap between particularly probably earlier adolescence and then young adulthood in the executive functioning areas. And I'm kind of curious, I haven't been able to find much on that, and I'd be curious what you think about that. And then more broadly, I'm a bit of a TED Talk addict, and so I had the pleasure of watching your TED Talk.
Thanks. So you've seen lots of this
Yeah,
before.
the first part of it at least. And there was an interesting question that a gentleman one of the organizers asked you at the end, and I thought your answer was evasive but cute at the same time. He asked you, what about this hard question of consciousness? And you keep talking about the easy questions. And I think along these lines with empathy and morality, he said, do you think we're going to be able to, in our lifetime, solve the hard question of consciousness? And you said, no. He said, why? And you said, well, there's a reason why they don't call it the hard question for nothing. And then, it was a 15-minute talk. It was TED Talks, whatever. This is the ivory towers of University of Washington. It's not a 15-minute talk, so I'd like to put you back on the spot with that question then.
Huh. Okay, I'm going to answer the easy question you asked me first, which is actually not at all easy. So the question that you asked about mindfulness is very interesting, and I don't exactly know the answer, so I'm going to answer a related but different question, to which I sort of do know the answer. So I think one really interesting question here is, how does the understanding of other people's minds relate to the understanding of one's own mind? And there's a lot of interesting theories out there. As I said, one kind of intuitive theory that many people are running with under many different names, but one of which is simulation theory, is the idea that understanding other minds always is parasitic on understanding of your own mind. So understanding of your own mind comes first. In some of these theories, it's simple, it's Cartesian. You have immediate and unproblematic access to your own mind. And all the problems come in the inference into the other mind. It's the gap between self and other that's the problem. And my work and the work in this line, in the theory of mind line of research, almost suggests the opposite, which is that we think about ourselves from the same perspective, with the same tools, the same strengths, and the same weaknesses that we use when we think about other people's minds. And so in some sense, obviously not in every sense, but in some sense, we are observers of our own selves, coming up with plausible accounts of our own actions. I'll give you one of the pieces of evidence for why I think this. So I showed you the kid being asked to explain, why did Ivan take, the 3-year-old who was asked to explain, why did Ivan take Joshua's sandwich? Why did he take the one on top? And the 3-year-old didn't appeal, as we would, to his belief. He didn't say, well, he thought it was his. And that's, as many people have argued, because 3-year-olds don't have the conceptual resources to come up with that hypothesis, which is why they couldn't make the prediction in the first place. And so he generates this new theory, what you might call a confabulation. He's just made up a plausible account that doesn't depend on beliefs about why Ivan would have taken Joshua's sandwich. His was dirty. Okay, so Danielle O'Neill and Christina Tantz did a version of this experiment where instead of asking you to explain somebody else's action, they asked you to explain your own action. So here's how it goes. You come into the study, you a 3-year-old, and I show you a crayon box, which is very exciting if you're a 3-year-old, and I say, do you want to draw? And the 3-year-old says yes, and you say, well, there's a piece of paper over there. Why don't you go get the piece of paper? So the 3-year-old dutifully goes to get the piece of paper and brings it back, at which point you open the box, and what's inside the box is ribbons, not crayons. Ribbons. And then you close it all back up and you ask the child, when you first came in here, what did you think was in the box? And this has actually been known for a while. What the children say is, I thought there were ribbons in the box. And then you say, well, why did you go get the piece of paper? And they say everything else except for, because I thought it was crayons. They say, I had to pick it up. It was on the floor. They could generate all kinds of other explanations. And it's seconds later. It's 30 seconds after they went to get the piece of paper. The crayon box is right there in front of them. And what they generate is these other confabulatory explanations, the same as they would do for a third person. So I've argued in general that we should think of our understanding of ourselves as this outside looking in theoretical reconstruction of a plausible self, very similar to and depending on the same mechanisms as our understanding of other people. And how that relates to your ability to then control your own mind in contexts like mindfulness, I think, is very interesting and understudied. And do I have to answer about hard problems of consciousness? Maybe I just talked enough about the first thing.
And ask you again.
What I would suggest is that maybe at the end you can come down, because I just want to give a few more people a chance to ask a question. So, well, you go ahead and on this side, and then we'll go back.
That's twice I escaped that question. That's awesome.
Yeah, and my question is much more shallow and simple.
Great.
So you'll love it. The graphs of the sighted and blind folks' results looked like the overall numbers were quite different. I wondered if that was statistically significant, and if so, how do you account for the difference?
Yeah, it's not statistically significant, although people always notice it. And it comes to, of course, it would make my rhetorical point easier if that were not the case. The absolute magnitude of fMRI responses is very hard to interpret. So how high those bars go, what's the magnitude of change in blood flow in your brain or my brain that I can measure with fMRI depends on a huge number of factors. Some of them are facts about our brain, how our blood flows, how the brain is shaped. Some of them depend on the scanner that day. Right? The scanner just has different higher and lower power. It depends on how long the scanner is running as it heats up. So the absolute magnitude of that signal is extremely hard to interpret, which is why fMRI analyses, to be confident, always interpret the response to one condition in proportion to the response to another condition in the same participant. It's very hard to compare amount of activation across participants. That's why we include all these control conditions. So we can say, here's the magnitude of the response to the control participant in these participants. Relative to that, what's the response to the key conditions? And if you do it that way, the response is about double in both populations. But obviously, for rhetorical purposes, I wish it were different.
Okay, well, maybe we'll take one more, and then, because I know we're past the time, and I appreciate everybody staying in, we're happy to stay here and answer your questions. But why don't we take one more on the mic, and then the others I think we're going to have to get afterwards.
I work in criminal law, and I'd like to suggest that your sociopath actually cares a lot. They care on the level of survival. As one client told me, there are two kinds of people in the world. They're the people who use you and the people you use.
Okay.
Thank you again for attending tonight.